Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Prolix, Comix, Bollix. As per usual, it's myself, Nick, and over there is...
It's myself, Clive. Hello there, Nick. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. So I'm hoping that you enjoyed my giant-sized man thing over the last week, Clive.
Nah. Yes, this this episode is co-hosted by Finbar Saunders in a Nick mask.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that has gone down in history probably as being the most unintentionally hilarious comic book title of all time.
Sized man. You do have to wonder when they were putting that together. No one said.
Hang about.
Was there like a rival comic at the same time that took all the heat away from it, called something like Giant-Sized Spurting Cock or something like that?
Could have. Well, in the 70s, it's very possible, but it was probably done by Robert Crumb.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, we're talking swamp monsters this week. We're focusing on Steve Gerber's seminal run on Man-Thing, but we're also probably going to dip into some of the other. It's a bit, you can't really talk about Man-Thing without also talking about Swamp Thing and the Heat and other kind of related swamp monster phenomenon.
Yeah. I mean, you'll probably know more than I do. In general, you're more versed in comics anyway than I am. But certainly unavoidable to talk about Swamp Thing because they seem to be almost twins from the same egg or something, right?
And well, we will talk a little bit about how, because that is very much the case, I think. Alexa, off. She likes to, play our music right when we start. So yeah, basically, but I mean, did you end up reading? I didn't get around to reading the story It by Theodore Sturgeon, which is supposedly the beginnings of all of this swamp malarkey. So in a way, maybe it makes sense for you. Before we even get to Steve Gerber or any of this, maybe we should talk about the fact that.
I mean, there's not that, but it's quite interesting because yes. So yeah, if you you go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole or whatever, it'll lead you at some point to this Theodore Sturgeon short story, first published in Unknown magazine in 1940, called It, and it's a I don't know 20-minute read or something like that. It's not a great story. I mean, I've read. I haven't read that much Theodore Sturgeon, but I've read better Theodore Sturgeon than this. But for some reason, it's in the same way as I don't like, for example, Robert Bloch's Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper, right? That's another one of those heavily anthologized short stories, which I've never really understood why everyone loves so much, because there's much better Robert Bloch stories than that. For me, this was similar with Theodore Sturgeon. But if the research on Man-Thing and stuff hadn't led to it, I don't think I would have put two and two together. It's not a story about a scientist working on something who fuses with chemicals in the swamp and then has to take revenge. It's just there is a swamp monster, and it seems to be made of organic. It's like a fusion of organic matter and a human being. So, but that seems to me something that's an older concept in 1940, wouldn't you? Like that seems almost something like there's must be one of the myths that has a bog or swamp or mug or muck monster, right? It doesn't strike me as something that Theodore Sturgeon would have invented. It could be that particular, I don't know, Unknown magazine, it might have been like the magazine that everyone read, and the people of that generation read it and remembered it and copied it. So I'm not saying it's bollocks that it isn't isn't the origin. But I'm
It's the
just saying,
Rosetta Stone of all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
muck monsters. But I will say, like, so the human feature, or like, do they ever get into who, like, that, like who the person is that?
not really, no.
Okay.
I mean, there's a little bit. I mean, there's a kind of a bit of a kind of twist to it, but it's not really related. I mean, like I said, it could be. I'm
Is he a
willing to
pilot? I
believe-
guess that's my question.
Is
Is he a pilot? Did he crash his plane into the swamp?
No, I don't think so. It's been
No. Okay. All right. Because for some reason I had got the impression that because I think that is a feature of the heap. Because my understanding is that the
Right.
story did directly influence the creation of the comic book character, the heap.
Okay. Well, the thing is that links it as well a little bit. If you're thinking about this, tree of, I mean, another version of this is the Quatermass man, incredible melting man, first man in this, comes back with a virus from. It's a very swamp-like kind of image, isn't it? A kind of melting gluttonous mass.
Right.
So yeah, could well be it is. I don't know if anyone's ever said outright, like either Stanley or someone has said, yes, we deliberately wanted to cash in on Theodore Sturgeon's story, but
Well,
it's more likely the heap is the connection.
Yeah,
right.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think so. The heap was inspired supposedly by it, and then the heap runs for quite a long time, I guess. Back in the 50s, and he is a big green-looking, kind of swampy-looking monster with a kind of a little root kind of nose, and so it does seem like visually he looks a lot like Man-Thing.
Have you read any heap?
No. As I said, I haven't.
Another
I've just seen images, and I've just kind of read a little bit about it. But then I think it does seem as though, to some degree, both Len Wein, who is the creator of Swamp Thing, and with Man Thing, it's a little weirder because apparently Stan Lee and Roy Thomas, I think, together kind of came up with the idea, and then they farmed the first script out to Jerry Conway, basically.
Right.
And so he actually writes the first story.
But there's a delay, isn't there? I think they do that in 71, which is also when Swamp Thing is conceived.
Yes.
So they're conceived around the same time, but also, weirdly enough, there's a delay, and both of them come out around the same time in 72, right? Like within a month of each other or something like that?
Yeah. And then what's interesting is the first appearance of, before we worry about maybe Man Thing, the first appearance of Swamp Thing is actually a kind of period piece. It's kind of set in like almost Victorian times, and it's a one-off short story with a beginning and a middle and an end. And it's quite beautifully drawn by Bernie Wrightson, who would go on to do actually the original run of comics. And it was in a sort of one of those, DC had their own kind of EC comics things that they were doing in the 70s, because EC, for people who don't know, was a comic book company that got in a lot of trouble in the 50s for doing these very good but sometimes quite gory horror stories. Right. And so the Comics Code comes along, which basically means you can't do that kind of stuff anymore. But by the 70s, DC is kind of, they know that there's still an appetite for these kind of horror stories, so they're doing slightly more sanitized versions. Right. And so they have this anthology.
I'm guessing some of the EC stuff must have been reprinted or repackaged or something in the latter half of the 60s, right? So that would have
I would imagine.
Yeah.
And I think it was something like Vault of Secrets or something like that it's called. Is this
is it House of Mystery, maybe?
House of Mystery? Yep, that might be it.
Right.
So it appears in House of Mystery, and I think
althoh Vault of Secrets was a nice valiant attempt, it's almost that, isn't it? It's pretty good. Shed of
mysteries. Yes, Shed of Enigmas. That's the one.
There we go. Shed of Enigmas. That's our horror comic anthology that we're going to write.
Okay. So yeah, so it's this kind of, and it basically it features a character called Alec.
Sorry, I'm just writing that down.
Okay, sure.
Shed of enigmas. That's because
Okay.
the future. There'll be another podcast about sheds that we do.
But anyway, so but basically the kind of the DNA of what becomes the long running Swamp Thing comic is there. It's about a human who gets kind of fused with chemicals and ends up falling in the swamp and coming back as a swamp monster. But as I said, it's not set in the present day when it was written. It's not set in the 70s. It's set like in the 1870s kind of a thing. And so when Len Wein decides, or when he's told, you know, we'd really like you to develop this into an actual, you know, monthly comic, he decides, well, he doesn't want to do this 1870s setting or whatever. He's going to set it in the now. And this is where it kind of becomes interesting, because he seems to almost create exactly the same story for the introduction of this new version of the Swamp Thing that has already run in Man Thing.
Right.
And the plot thickens when we discover that Jerry Conway, who is the guy who wrote that first script, lived with Len Wein, like as roomies, as buddies.
Right.
And they were working for kind of intermittently for Marvel and for DC. And so untangling exactly who influenced what and who knew what, and it's nobody really knows.
Right. Right.
But it almost doesn't matter, because to be honest, very quickly the two go in very different directions, and the main characters are really nothing alike, other than that they're shambling, muck-encrusted swamp monsters. They're really not that similar, in fact.
They're tonally quite different, right? I mean, we'll get into this a little bit more later on, when I get to kind of my opinion of it. But Man Thing is like, and everything at Marvel is part of a Stan Lee worldview, right?
Sure.
Which, yeah, we'll get into that, because that's something I find slightly problem. I don't want to have a go at old Uncle Stan, because he is such a beloved and undead figure now. But yeah, I'm not necessarily you know, a huge fan of that. Certainly not as much as some people are, but we'll get there.
Sure.
So I had never. So you suggested doing Man Thing. I was quite happy to go along with it, because I knew of Man Thing, but I had never actually read Man Thing before. For one reason, and this isn't just unique to this, is just something a wider thing we'll probably talk about anytime we'll, you know, across several episodes eventually. But I tend to be, I quite like, I notice this is something slightly different between you and me, is if I find out about something of potential interest to me, whether it be a comics or book or music or whatever, I tend to, and sometimes this doesn't work out very well, I tend to try and go to the original source thing first. And I've noticed you go the other route, which is to seek out like a primer about what's the best of that thing, or a good place to start, and then that's your entry point. Right? I think that's fair to say. And this bites me on the ass, because often the start point is not necessarily that interesting, right? And you could maybe, I've learned from you a little bit over this. I've thought, oh, now what would Nick would find a good starting point, and then retroactively go back and use it. And I think that's probably the way to go. But I just have that type of slightly OCD kind of mentality, right? But
I think the joke is we probably both get to the same place in the end of having seen all of it, or read all of it, or watched all of it. But it's just that I'll start with something that makes sure that I'll want to go back, I guess, to the beginning.
Here's a question for you. If you have a plate of food, different kind of foods in front of you, do you eat the things that you like most first, or do you deny gratification until the end and eat the stuff you want?
No, I would definitely eat what I wanted what I like most first, and,
See, I'm the
work
opposite.
towards. Okay,
No,
there you go.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Okay.
So anyway, the reason I bring this up is, so in the case of one thing that sometimes I do, taking this approach is sometimes a bit awkward, because it's not as if, I mean, now it's a little bit more simple because some people have curated and collected, you know, you can buy like the complete Man thing and it takes all but if you're not doing it that way, you're like, no. There's no such thing as like, well, there is a Swamp Thing 1, but that's not where it's, you know, or in this case, it's Astonishing Tales number 12, right? And then after that,
For Man Thing, yes.
Jumps, and then it's like he's a character in a Howard the Duck or a Daredevil, or what the fuck, and eventually he gets his own comic, right? So I've always find it slightly off-putting, because I don't quite know where to start, you know. So so I knew of Man Thing, but for that reason, whatever, I'd never got round to it before. So yes, I was quite pleased that you kind of prepared a little package for me, which had everything in more or less the right order, leading up to, like you said, of course, there's lots of different iterations, but yeah, what is considered the seminal run, right, which is Man Thing and Giant Size Man Thing and a few other bits and bobs.
Adventures in Fear, basically a bunch of it, kind of,
But basically, the Steve Gerber, like you said, he kind of took over, and people
quite quickly. Really, there's really only a couple of things before he takes over. So really, you really are starting at the beginning. In fact, what I gave you is pretty much the beginning to. There's not much after that, I suspect, that's actually worth reading. I feel like later Man Thing kind of it comes and goes. It's come back. It's been revived a few times, but none of it looks particularly
the Man Thing version 2, or whatever you'd want to call it, is not the equal to Alan Moore's take on Swamp Thing.
Absolutely not. No.
Right.
And so, I mean, I guess we we'll just by way of explaining how I got interested in Man Thing. It was through Swamp Thing. I would have read Swamp Thing first. Probably started with Alan Moore's run, read that, then wanted to go back and read from the beginning. So read the beginning stuff by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, but I think I read right through up to the beginning of the Alan Moore. So I read a lot of crappy Swamp Thing, because it takes a precipitous nosedive in quality for quite a while before Alan Moore takes over and kind of But what surprised me so then having read all that, I was like, well, I felt a hankering for more Swamp Monster. Looked into Man Thing, started reading Man Thing, and became increasingly surprised as I went through the Steve Gerber's comics at how much I had thought that Alan Moore had kind of staked out and created his own. Some of what he did seemed less envelope pushing to me. After reading Steve Gerber's run, realizing that Steve Gerber's run comes like a full decade or more before what Alan Moore was doing, I was like, hang on.
Yeah.
But
I don't think Alan Moore has ever necessarily dodged. I mean, I think he's always been pretty upfront that he has been heavily influenced by Man Thing as much as Swamp Thing, right? I don't think he's ever said like, I've never heard of Man Thing,
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe so we can maybe just jump into this whole question of Man Thing. So Man Thing is starts out as a human being called Ted Sallis, who is a scientist, very much like, as I said, our Swamp Things, Alec Holland. And in this case, he's trying to come up with and I don't know if this has been, and this is one of the things that will annoy you, because this is a very Marvel-y kind of thing to do, but whether this has been retroactively done later on, that he was working on trying to recreate the super soldier serum that had created. But I feel like that doesn't actually really get mentioned in this run.
No,
it's
not
more
really.
like
I mean,
he's something about
a secret. They do mention a serum he's working on, but it seems very generic. Like I can imagine, it's not specific. No one mentions, Captain America or
right. So anyway, he's working on a secret serum. He basically has a dodgy girlfriend who it turns out is really working for a group of kind of semi-terrorists who want this serum for their own nefarious ends. And this all happens in a very beautifully drawn. That first story is very nice. It's all in grays because it was published in one of the more adult magazines. Marvel did publish stuff in the 70s at magazine size where they didn't have to abide by the comics code and could have more kind of scantily clad women and more violence.
Some of the stuff in that particular comic, actually, that I like some of the stuff.
The rest of that issue is really interesting. The other stories, we won't necessarily talk about them here, but it is like, whoa, okay, this is not the Marvel, this is not your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But that story, as I said, it's beautifully drawn in these kind of gray tones, and Ted Sallis ends up in the swamp covered in this chemical, comes back out having been transformed into this sort of swamp monster. And that's kind of it in a way. They do come back to her once in another story that I think is published also in one of those kind of more adulty looking things.
And there was also a text story as well, wasn't there, early on?
Yes. But that is Steve Gerber already, I think.
Right, which I have to confess, I did skip over that. I didn't actually.
It's not a comic.
No, and I started reading it, and it wasn't like, oh, this is really great prose or anything. So I didn't bother with it.
But yeah, so basically, I think what's interesting is the main difference between Swamp Thing and Man Thing that happens right away is that Swamp Thing is allowed to keep his mind, right? He's trapped in, he is also trapped inside almost exactly the same origin story, right? But when he comes out of the swamp, he's still fully, in his mind at least, a human being, right? And he has thoughts, and basically he relearns to speak as the stories go on over time.
And he's closer to a superhero as well, in a way. Like he has sentient thoughts, and he uses, he has more kind of Man Thing's abilities or powers or whatever are a bit, they're not, they're never really defined. Like, he's just a big lump that that can help out if you need a big lump, right?
Yes.
Not so much. It's not like he can run a million miles an hour, or he is on the side of, I will get into this again, he's kind of on the side of good. I mean, that whole the monster's actually the good guy stuff, but it's he's a bit more just like this force of nature or something that hangs out in the swamp. And he's more of an animal, because you don't know it. There are moments where he might just hurt you as well. And it's not really and this is, depending on your point of view, a strength or a bad thing about weakness. That's the word I was looking for. Like, the weakness of the story is they're not. Swamp Thing is kind of about Swamp Thing, right? He is the and Man
focus
Thing
of the action, and he propels the story forward, whereas Man Thing shambles in at occasional moments.
And it's stories about totally other unrelated things, and then suddenly, there's Man Thing, right? So so take that as you will. That's, like I said, that's either a strength and a weakness depending on what you want from.
I suppose if you've read both of them, then you already have Swamp Thing as your heroic swamp monster, and then Man Thing is its own thing, right? Right.
But I wonder if that was a conscious, I mean, were they keeping an eye on each other's products, and
I think absolutely
deliberately kind of, okay, well, we'll do this, and you do that, and rather than getting each other's way.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel as though probably they did. Yeah, they would have had an eye. And I think it's interesting when you read the letters pages in these issues, because they do sometimes reference what's going on, over at DC with Swamp Thing, and some people are saying they want Man Thing to be more like that, and other people are saying no, that's that's a separate thing. But so Steve Gerber, I think, so as I said, we start off with a couple of stories by Jerry Conway, and then weirdly enough, Len Wein, who writes Swamp Thing does the second actual published Man Thing story, right? Which is drawn by Neil Adams, who did a very famous run on Batman. But it gets published in the middle of this Khazar story, which is very weird.
Yeah.
And
Khazar
anyway.
being like a Tarzan-y kind of.
Yeah. Tarzan meets He-Man meets something else. Yeah. So yeah, that's not a great story.
One of those things that you can imagine them in the office, like coming up with the name Khazar, like just the first noise that came into someone's head that sounded vaguely in that area, right?
I will say one of the things I always enjoy most about 70s comics is the ads pages. And so particularly all the jujitsu senseis in New York and stuff at the time, like all those, just the sketchiness of what's in those ads is wonderful. But anyway, so yeah, Steve Gerber comes on pretty early, and I think he was already writing. So he, I guess, comes from, and this shows up in the stories very clearly later on, he comes from an advertising background. Like he was writing ad copy and stuff. And I think was increasingly frustrated with the limits, creatively of that kind of job, and what he was maybe what you do in the world when you write ad copy. And so I had started to work for Marvel as a freelancer. And so he, around the same time, he does, I think, runs on Doctor Strange. They kind of give him the slightly weirder characters to work with, because I think they could see his sensibility went that direction.
So as we pointed out, Man Thing isn't necessarily his creation, but he's most well associated. Did he create I suppose his most famous character he's associated with, other than this, is Howard the Duck? Yes. Did he?
And Howard the Duck? Yes. And Howard the Duck shows up first. The very first appearance of Howard the Duck is in Man Thing.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre. Yes, on one of the strange other dimension or other planet stories, or which, again, threw me a little bit and I'm not sure in a good way or a bad way. But so just seeing as we're doing Gerber, because again, I know nothing of Howard the Duck other than the film. Have you read the Howard the Duck comics?
Not much, no.
Okay, because I'm just wondering. It seems like one of those things. So, for example, the analogy I always make to this is, like, for me, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is just a bunch of crap, like these horrible kids' cartoons and shit films that came out in the 90s.
Yes,
but I am aware that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles does have started from a place where it was considered like it's an underground comic, isn't it?
Yes,
it's like. And it is much respected. Is it Kevin Eastman? Is that the?
Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman. Yeah.
Right. But I am totally not aware of that, and I haven't gone back to. I will at some point. So for me, I don't understand that part of it. So I'm just wondering, is Howard the Duck? Howard the Duck, from what I understand, does seem to have a proper following, like the original Howard the Duck stuff. It's quite good, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't read that much of it, but my feeling is that it was what I feel like when I read Gerber stories. I feel like here's a guy who was trying to push, again, maybe the envelope of what comics would allow at the time, and certainly what a comic that was being published under the comics books code, that was like a monthly color, like just a bog standard Marvel comic. He was going to see just how far editorial would let him go, right?
Right.
And so even in creating something like Howard the Duck, which in a way is his attempt and Marvel's attempt to do, Fritz the Cat, but not, you know what I mean? Like a countercultural, countercultural to a point,
right?
But not to the point where the comics code will shut them down. And I see like as his run kind of progresses on Man Thing, you can kind of see him just trying things, and that's what's exciting to me, because it doesn't all work. Like there's definitely stuff that falls horribly flat. Some of the early stuff is so heavy-handed. Like there's an evil developer whose name is F.A. Schist, right? Which is
yes. No,
wow.
some of the establishment characters are they're very
Hilariously broadly
mustache
drawn.
twirling kind of and some of the stuff with some of the like the non-veteran characters and stuff as well is a little bit
no, it definitely doesn't all work, and some of it seems very dated. But then every now and again you'll get a story where it really is like a number of the characters are struggling with mental health issues, which to me is not something you saw in comics.
Right, that's true. Yeah,
for this, and to be honest, not for a long time, not after either.
More than one person comes seeking to maybe commit suicide by jumping in the swamp. For example, right?
And some succeed. Like one character, like there's the one about the clown where he does actually kill himself. Right. And again, that's quite rare. That's quite rare for a Marvel comic to.
Right, but again, so just to get into a little bit of what I felt, because this was an interesting exercise for me, because I like good comics, obviously, and that's why I'm doing this YouTube video. But also at the same time, it's something I need to know, and that's why another reason I'm doing it is an engine of kind of discovery. But I know you're someone who has been more steeped in comics for longer. Like I checked out of comics for a very long time and then kind of came back, and I feel as if you've always somewhat had your toe in the waters, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you keep up to date with the new stuff, but you're always going to have a comic that you're about to read or are reading, or it's like something that's a fairly consistent part of your life. Whereas for me, they totally went out for a while and then came back, and so it's almost like learning the language, relearning the language of comics. Right. And I remember lending a friend of mine who's older than me, and I don't think he's read a comic in like 40 years or something. I remember lending him a very good graphic. It was From Hell, actually.
Okay, yes.
And I was saying, a very atypical, the kind of graphic novel that people who don't normally read comics would read. And I know he's interested in the subject matter and everything. And I gave him From Hell, and then I didn't hear back from him for a long time. And I was asking how he, and then suddenly handed it back to me one day. And well, what did you think? And he said, I tried a million times, and I've forgotten how to read comics. He couldn't figure it out, the speed of it, or when you read that. And that sounds silly, and I would imagine it especially sounds silly to someone if they've consistently read comics. But it is a thing, and it is tricky. It is like a muscle or something that you have to keep up. So just keep that in the back. You have to bear with me for a little while while I exercise that muscle.
Yeah, absolutely.
So reading Man-Thing was a bit of a because it's different from reading, for instance, we did when we did Cutie Honey in the first episode. The speed and pace and the way that Japanese comics in general, it's a totally different thing.
Yes. And
I've read more of those type of comics recently, so I'm slightly more accustomed. This was going back to, I mean, I don't know, I don't know about this. You might know, you might be able to speak to this more than me. Is this still the language of comics now, or have comics changed? Is this a slightly...
No, I would say it's, I mean, there has been there has been a pronounced influence of Japanese comics on Western comics. So there tends to be more maybe splash pages, and there may be more action, like, whereas comics tended to be very text heavy.
Right.
For sure. And I think they're a bit less text heavy now, but generally speaking, it's not that different, really. Okay. American comics still kind of look like this. And what's interesting too, so my friend Tavis, I can remember talking to him, and he was fascinated the first time, because he grew up with North American comics. He grew up with DC and Marvel stuff, and then underground stuff as well. But when he first got things like the Eagle reprints of Judge Dredd or the Quality comics. He didn't know how to read them because he's like they keep recapping after every 5 pages. Like, what in God's name is going on? Because the way that they pump, and there's so much action going on in each 5 pages.
Yeah,
like each 5, like an American comic would have stretched that story across 30 pages.
Right.
What Pat Mills or Alan Grant or those guys would do in 5 pages in a copy of 2000 AD.
Yes.
And then in Japan, you would stretch that 5 pages over 70 pages. You know what I mean? Like there's this different pacing for the visuals of storytelling, right?
And this is the most problematic for me, maybe because I didn't grow up reading that much in the way of American. 2000 AD would have very much what I was weaned on as well, after Beano and Dundee and stuff like that. So so this style of American comics of this era, and I guess Marvel and DC were doing similar stuff. They are slightly problematic for me because I do love the artwork. I do really enjoy the artwork, but I do find the stories like a little like I kind of know what the arc's gonna be. And I almost don't have the patience to read all the text to get to what I know it's going to be. I don't know how you feel, but it's like, and so the Stan Lee thing as well is, so like you said, there were some of these other comics, like the magazine format ones, that were slightly different. But in general, these comics, they seem to ascribe to like a worldview or something, which is there's a real uniform worldview across all this stuff, right? And we get it. The bad guy, the monsters are not the real bad guys. It's not very Guillermo del Toro as well does this. The monsters are the good guys, freaks, not Browning kind of thing. But it's so prevalent that I want something. It's like if you seasoned every dish with exactly the same seasoning. Do you know what I mean? It all has a certain flavor to it, and it's like, for fuck's sake, like, give me another way of looking at the world or something. Give me another point of view. Give me, something. I just find it very, because it all is all coming from the same. I know there are different artists and writers, and I'm not to do them a disservice, but this very much is the world according to Stan Lee, isn't it? And it's a fair world, like, where eventually the right things happen and the bad guys get punished, and like, if you've grown up with the cynicism of 2000 AD, for example, it's sometimes you're like, no, don't, I don't want Man-Thing to turn up and help the escaped orphan, eat the orphan, go on your fucking Man-Thing, like, just something a bit different now and again. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or am I just being a grumpy old man?
No, I do, but there's a few things that I would say to maybe temper it. One is that I don't know that in the early to mid 70s that was the prevailing, what was going on in comics necessarily. I mean, I will agree with you that by the 80s, and when we now think about things like X-Men, you're right, there's all of this kind of stuff that seems to be worthy, I guess, right? Maybe. But I don't necessarily know that some of what was going on in those episodes of Man-Thing were going on anywhere else in mainstream comics at the time.
Okay.
Like, I do think that now, for better or for worse, whether you like what's going on or not, but that Steve Gerber was there's a palpable anger every now and again that's surprising to me, because I don't see it in comics of that time. Like, there's the one about the chubby kid who gets, like, run to death by his gym teacher. There's stuff going on there that I don't think you would have seen.
Okay, but again, you've said a few times now, in that world, at that time, in that, there's There's
Yeah.
a slight amount of special pleading there, right? So I'm just wondering, do you think
Well,
these
no,
comics work
I
well
don't think
outside of that context?
I don't think you could. Well, I mean, I find them pleasing, but I don't think that you can divorce. There's no timeless art that's disconnected
No,
from
no,
its
no.
place,
No, no, no.
right? There's no ranking that you can just go. Yeah, I mean, I
No,
don't.
but there are some things that just work regardless of when they were made. Like they work for you, you know, regardless of what you know was going on around them, or like so for instance, with these Man-Thing comics, I can appreciate everything that you've said, and I was thinking of some of that while I was reading it, but again, that's like other outside of that, just in terms of the amount of just pure pleasure I got from reading it. I didn't get that much.
Well, you know, I mean, mileage will always vary, right?
No, I know, but I was just curious because I think you enjoyed these more than I did.
Yeah,
But-
I think so.
Yeah, but I was just wondering, but was it just pure pleasure on your part, or did you also find like it a bit of a struggle sometimes, or was it actually fairly easygoing?
Oh yeah, as I said, what I said was what is interesting to me is that it's wildly inconsistent. You know,
Right.
there are definitely issues and double. Like sometimes a story will take place across two issues where I was like, oh yeah, like this doesn't hold up well, and you know,
Right.
having remembered having read it through the first time, things that bothered me the first time bothered me more the second time. Things that were
Right.
sluggishly paced, things that were heavy-handed in ways that just seemed silly, right?
Yeah.
But the things that had impressed me the first time, in some ways, impressed me even more. I think coming back to it now.
So let's ask that question the other way around. It was there. I'm guessing the answer is yes. By the way you're talking, were there some stories that you thought that was great? I really enjoyed that particular issue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Right. I didn't have that at all.
Okay.
Like I had varying degrees of, like some were not, you know, but then other ones were, yeah, and also always with that slight, oh yeah, for what this is good kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there was never, I don't think there was one issue that jumped out at me that was like, fuck yeah, that was a great issue.
Okay.
That should be in like some kind of, you know, comics for all time collection or something like that.
One of the things that struck me on this reread, there's a right near the end of the run, there's this bizarre couple of episodes or issues where they introduced this sort of like, I don't know what he's supposed to be, like David Bowie, Lou Reedy kind of rock star guy, right?
Right.
And then this mad Viking character who wants to you know, set the world back to men being men and all of this stuff, you know, and then it kind of segues into this whole thing about this crazy woman kind of PTA meeting, like that whole kind of like really how he winds down, because most of the stories take place in this fictionalized Florida sort of swamp town called Citrusville.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, it seemed more and more ridiculous. And then there was this moment where I was looking at the image of all of these people going ape shit, and this guy in a Viking hat at the head of them. And I was like, because immediately I saw the storming of the Capitol building by the QAnon people wearing their Viking helmets and spouting effectively the same kind of MAGA bullshit. And here it is in a comic book that seems ridiculous.
Right.
In the mid 70s, and yet eerily prescient.
Yeah.
You know, things like that. That jumped out at me this time. I was like, shit, like Gerber does have his finger on a pulse of a part of America that is still very much there. And I don't know, as I said, I don't know the extent to which it was ever shown in comics.
Right. Yeah. No.
Before that run on Man-Thing.
No, that's interesting.
I also think maybe
you can bring that context that I can't bring myself. So it's
well, the other thing is, how much of Swamp, the original run of Swamp Thing, did you read in doing this? Because I did send you those as well, right?
Yeah, I read about half of them,
Okay.
And yes, that wasn't as well, compelling is not the right word, because I didn't necessarily find it compelling, but yes, that was, I can certainly see why people would prefer the original run of Man-Thing to Swamp Thing, but they were both slightly similarly problematic for me, in so much as they're not quite what I want. But then again, that's more my problem than the. So the thing is, I love the idea of a man fused with organic matter in a swamp. Just that alone is fantastic, right? And the original run of Swamp Thing, doesn't really do it for me in the same way as the later Alan Moore one, closer to what I wanted from it. And then Man-Thing is almost not about that at all. Like, it's about other shit, and then now and again, Man-Thing will snap the alligator in half.
Yeah, there's a lot of him murdering. I forgot about that.
At least like 4 or 5 times.
At least, maybe more than that. Yes, I was kind of laughing at that because there is this element of him as this kind of like, you know, avatar of the ecosystem or whatever, but he's always
he doesn't like alligators,
killing big lizards.
So between the two of them, I don't think they gave me like what I was after anyway. And so I wanted to talk to you about this as well, because that was the other thing, was like, I know now we're living in that post-modern world where you're looking back at what people like, you know, Alan Moore and people did, and now maybe thinking, actually we maybe want to go back further, earlier, sense of fun and all that. But then I'm wondering now if it's time for the post-modern world, because in reading these very episodic things, what I realized was, because it's easy to lose sight of, you know, it's the whole Emperor's New Clothes thing and everything. It's very easy to lose sight now of how revolutionary things like Saga of the Swamp Thing were, because what they were doing, I suppose, in essence, is these, and like you said, it's fans for fans, and that's problematic in one way. But in the other way, what's good about it is it's this generation who grew up reading these very episodic comics, but squeezed the essence of what they liked about them. So the Alan Moore run of Swamp Thing is kind of like Swamp Thing and Man-Thing, and get rid of all the other elements. And this is about Swamp Thing. This is the Swamp Thing story. This is the fetid kind of Everglades atmosphere. That's what you want, kind of thing. So, and I think we might have, you know, lost sight of that in a way, because now we're almost bored of that, right? At the end of that cycle, and it became too serious, and, you know, they up their own ass, and that is true. But then again, there's something to be said about this wave, you know, the later wave, where they took the essence of what was interesting about these comics and then made like really streamed down, like, so there's that run, the Alan Moore run, doesn't have, you know, a clown going there, and then the next one is a slave on the run, and another one it's, you know, save our swamp, and then all the stuff where they go to another planet. Was, I couldn't be doing with that. That I had no patience for that, because it was, again, but that's a personal that's another little line in the sand between you and me there. I think you have a lot more tolerance for D&D style horse shit than I do, right? Like, I don't like thinking characters called Gar the Mighty and crap like that.
But I found it all amusing. I wasn't.
Yeah, see, you found it amusing, whereas I actually actively made me angry.
So,
no.
I read it with a smirk more than anything else. But I think, should we speak for a moment to all the other, because you know, there's a Man-Thing movie, which has nothing to do with any of this.
Oh, and it's pretty bad. Although rewatching it very briefly, just kind of skipping through it a bit, The only thing I did kind of appreciate about it now because it's a proper Marvel film, but
I
it's
know.
before the
It's-
Marvel Cinematic Universe started.
Yes, yeah.
I appreciated how gory it was.
Yeah, it's surprisingly sleazy,
Yeah,
in
it's got
tone.
it's opens with a blonde with a nice rack getting covered in blood, that
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Yeah, I was surprised too. I
Yeah.
remember being like, but then it,
But it is
as I
crap.
said, yeah, it really has nothing to do with anything.
It's not nothing to do with Man Thing, and it is crap. But it's just nice to see that they went. I appreciate that they went for it.
Yeah.
Way.
Uh,
Even
and
though
I'm
it's
not
not in the spirit of the comics, really. But
I'm not a huge fan, sadly, of Wes Craven's Swamp Thing movie.
yeah, I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember it being pretty poor. But then again, then we got Return of Swamp Thing, right? So
it's boring.
yeah.
And then, to be honest, I prefer Return of Swamp Thing. I think in a weird way it has more to do with the comics in fact, and it's got that French guy in it who I like, whose name I can't remember at all, but he plays Anton Arcane in that.
Louis something.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But
TV series.
And yes, and there was an old TV series with the guy who played Swamp Thing in the movies, Dick DeRock or whatever his name was, and then there was a much more recent one, like 2-3 years ago.
How was that?
I wanted it to be better than it was. It kind of, it didn't know what it wanted to be. It didn't know it should have committed to either just being Alan Moore's run or not. But it kind of tried to pull bits from what Alan Moore did and then bits from the original run. And
right,
Virginia Madsen's in it. She's one of the better things about it, funnily enough.
The old TV series also had some episodes stitched together to create these fake features that turned up on Japanese television.
Okay.
Swamp Thing movies as well.
Right. But anyway, so it's not going to be a ringing endorsement from you then. You're not going to send people out to read the original run.
No, as much as I would like I said, Swamp Monster, yes, please. But, and I suppose, like I said, I would point you in the direction of the Alan Moore, and there might be, like I said, I don't know the world well enough. There might be other good Swamp Thing comics as well. I don't know about that, or if Alan Moore's run is still considered. And I'm not even, I'm not an Alan Moore fanboy as such. I have huge problems with some of the stuff that he does, but I do like what you like.
Well, no, I would agree that that's probably Alan Moore nearly at his best. Is his run on Swamp Thing, and his run on Swamp Thing is fantastic. That's what got me into the whole Swamp Monster thing in the first place. I was just, as I said, I was surprised going back to the Steve Gerber run that some of the eco stuff, some of the kind of some of the politics, I guess, some of the kind of, and even some of the experimenting with form, some of the experimenting with again, whether it annoys you or not, but putting in text passages into a comic book. And in one way, it's funny because you're defeating the purpose of comics. Right. The whole point is it's a visual medium, but I don't know that anyone else was trying that kind of thing in mainstream comics. Again, maybe in underground comics, certainly people might have been tinkering with those kind of things.
Right. But, I would go if you're totally if you're interested in Swamp Monsters but you don't know out, I would go the Nick Primer route on this one. Go for Alan Moore Saga or something, and then work backwards if you're interested in the. Don't do what I did and don't start with, Astonishing Tales number 12 or whatever. This is probably best to go the Nick route on this one.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. For sure. If you've never read about a swamp monster before, you want to pick up that first issue. The only sad thing is, like, the big reveal of his very first issue that he writes is connected to the nature of what Swamp Thing is in Alan Moore's. And so if but whatever. Yeah. It is probably still the best place to start.
Yeah. And we're still awaiting the definitive screen adaptation of either of these.
Yes.
I'm wondering if now that, anything that Marvel Touch seems to be getting a film version, I'm wondering if there is if there are plans, I mean, because Man Thing, I know it's not necessarily, you know, among their most beloved characters, but
Mhm.
I mean, it has, you know, people know of it. It's not
Yeah,
like
yeah.
super obscure.
No, it's got a cult following for
Yeah.
sure.
In fact, I would say it's more visible in a way than Suicide Squad is to DC, right? So
Mhm.
that got a
Yeah.
movie. So I'm wondering if there is plans for a, as I mean, on the one hand, I'm like thinking, oh, for fuck's sake, how long are we going to get these fucking Marvel films for? And
Mhm.
never get bored.
Oh,
But,
forever. I don't
yeah,
think there's any escaping
well,
them
that's the
now.
thing. So I'm like, well, okay, if you're resigned to it, then
Mhm.
why not Man Thing?
Mhm. Agree. And why not a giant-sized Man Thing? Really.
Giant-sized Man Thing for the
Um,
the Pawn spin-off.
I I think the last thing I'd like to just say is, and we kind of talked about this very briefly, but you know, the other half of comics. I mean, I've been talking about Steve Gerber a lot, but the other half of comics is the
Yes.
drawings.
Yeah, I think
And
the
so
problem, the reason we didn't is just because there's a number of different artists.
there are three who are really fairly consistent across. There is the artist who designed the character, Gray Morrow, which is a great name. And you know, his is in some ways maybe the definitive, that first comic, beautifully drawn, and you know, and then Val Mayrick comes in and does a creditable job. But I really like the weird art style of the guy who comes after, Mike Plug, partly because his art reminds me a lot of Ian Gibson, who did Robo Hunter in 2000 AD. Although Mike Plug would probably predate, and Mike Plug also, he worked for Ralph Bakshi in one of those weird, maybe it was Wizards.
Okay.
He might have done some of the design work for Wizards, I think. And so he's the first one who kind of takes away the weird hanging long eyebrows, and kind of like, because there's this kind of weird thing where Man Thing has this kind of long, trunky, you know, nose and these long kind of Fu Manchu eyebrow things like that hang down, and then he kind of cuts them back and he streamlines the look of the actual Man Thing, I think. And then later artists kind of bring them back, and I was annoyed. I was like, no, I think Plug figured out.
The Morrow ones jumped out at me as well as being closer to what I like. And then I mean, the thing with American group stuff is it's, even though that it is distinctive, especially to someone with the eye for it more like you do than I do, but even for the layman like me, I can kind of see, but there's still a certain uniformity, right, to fit within that format, and so it's difficult sometimes to pick out, you know, it's all a bit of a jumble of although even though the Grey Morrow stuff is more to my liking, I think Swamp Thing the definitive Man Thing should be in color. He's got to be
green and brown.
Right, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed. So I think we can leave it there. We'll say, you know, if you want, if you want to get into some Swamp Monster, maybe start with Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, and then, you know, as for the rest of it, your mileage may vary. Yes. So until next time on Prolix, Comix, Bollix, I've been Clive Davis, and he has been Nick. Until next time then, see ya. Ta-ra.